On the morning of the event, the man at the door didn't hesitate. He glanced at the clipboard, barely lifted his eyes to meet mine, and said, "Sir, you're not on the list. You'll have to wait outside." No warmth, no curiosity, just a line he'd clearly rehearsed for anyone who didn't belong. For a moment, I thought he must be mistaken. I'd arrived earlier than necessary, because I wanted to take in the room before the crowd arrived, to stand in the quiet space I'd helped make possible, and feel it once without the noise. I was wearing the best suit I owned, the one that only came out for the rare days that felt worth remembering. The tie was navy with tiny silver dots, a gift from my wife years ago, chosen because it made you look like you had something important to say. The shoes were polished the night before until they reflected the lamp on my kitchen table. I had dressed with intention, with care, with pride. The invitation, the one they were now acting like didn't exist, had been personal. A call, not an email. The voice on the other end had told me, "We wouldn't be here without you. It's only right you're there with us." I'd hung up that night with a rare sense of anticipation. And yet, here I was, standing on the threshold of a room that was supposed to honor the past, watching that same past, my past, get filtered at the door. Inside, I could see glimpses of people I'd known for decades. Men I'd once stayed late in the office with, hammering out plans at 2 a.m. women I'd vouched for when no one else believed in them. Now they brushed past me without a glance, their names checked off effortlessly, their bodies angling toward the warmth of the hall. And in those rare moments when a familiar face did meet my eyes, there was something quick and nervous there, a recognition followed by a retreat, a look that said, "I can't stop for you right now." The hallway outside the entrance was polished marble, the kind that amplified every sound. My footsteps, hesitant now, echoed in a way that made me feel both present and invisible at the same time. The air was cooler out here, as though even the climate had been divided between those inside and those left waiting. The man at the door pointed toward a narrow wooden bench along the wall, the kind of seat meant for people passing time they didn't want to spend here. I sat, the wood cold beneath me, the smell of fresh flowers drifting faintly from the open doors. Through them came the muted swell of music, the rise and fall of polite laughter, the hum of glasses meeting in toasts. I pictured the inside, white tablecloths, polished cutlery, the stage lit just enough to flatter whoever stood there. I imagined the speeches that would be made, full of big words like vision and dedication, words that sounded noble but often erased the people who had lived them. I had written speeches like that once, for others. I knew the rhythm, the way the sentences would climb toward applause. The longer I sat there, the more I realized this wasn't just about a missed name on a list. It was about erasure. It was about someone, somewhere, deciding I no longer fit into the version of the story they wanted to tell. And yet the strange thing was, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Because I knew something they didn't. The program hadn't started. The lights hadn't dimmed. The keynote, the one they were all waiting for, hadn't been spoken. And sometimes the people kept outside the door are the very ones the room ends up turning toward. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel and share this video. That's how you help us grow and bring you more heartfelt stories every day. Now, we continue. A few weeks before that day, the invitation had felt almost like a homecoming. It wasn't some mass email blasted to hundreds. It was a phone call, direct and personal, from someone high enough in the chain that their voice carried weight. I still remember the warmth in their tone, that deliberate, practiced sincerity people use when they want you to feel seen. They told me there would be a gathering to honor the people who built the foundation, the ones whose work still shaped the organization years later. "It wouldn't be right without you there," they'd said, and I'd believed them. I'd hung up that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about who I might see again, about how it might feel to walk into that room and know I'd been remembered. I imagined handshakes with old colleagues, quiet nods of recognition, maybe even the kind of brief, Genuine thanks that sometimes slip through on nights like that. I didn't need applause, I just wanted to be acknowledged. But standing there in that marble hallway, the echo of footsteps around me, it was as though the weeks between the invitation and now had been erased. No one inside seemed to recall the phone call, the promises, the gratitude. Guests streamed past me without hesitation, their names ticked off by the man with the clipboard, their coats taken by staff at the door. Every so often one would glance at me, that quick flicker of recognition followed immediately by the calculated avoidance, as though my presence was an inconvenient truth they'd rather not address. The distance between the open doors of the hall and the bench where I sat felt wider than it should have been. Inside, the lights were warm, spilling over white tablecloths, crystal glasses, polished cutlery. I could see the glow against the ceiling, hear the first faint notes of music, and the gentle rise and fall of small talk. Outside, in the hallway, the air was cooler, almost stale, as though it had been left behind along with the people who weren't meant to be part of the celebration. I thought about that call again, about the weight in the words, "It wouldn't be right without you." Did they say it to everyone? Or was it true when they said it, only to become inconvenient later? I remembered the way I'd told myself this invitation meant something more than courtesy. That I had earned my place in that room, not as a guest, but as someone whose name was woven into its very history. Now, watching others pass me on their way inside, smiling and laughing as though the night belonged to them, alone, I felt the sharp edge of the truth. The people who claim to value your place in their story are often the same ones who try to write you out of it when it no longer serves them. And yet, I stayed, because I knew that history has a way of slipping through the cracks no matter how tightly they try to seal it. And sometimes the truth doesn't need an invitation to walk into the room. They began arriving in small waves, each new group passing close enough that I could catch fragments of perfume, cologne, the faint scent of pressed fabric fresh from dry cleaning. People I had once known well, people I had sat across from in late-night meetings, celebrated small victories with, even defended when their mistakes could have cost them everything, now walked past me as if I were part of the wallpaper. I saw the familiar faces first in the corner of my eye, that half-second where recognition flares before a decision is made, and the decision every time was the same. Eyes lowered, expressions neutral, movements just a fraction quicker. The silence between us wasn't casual, it was deliberate. They didn't just avoid talking to me, they avoided acknowledging that I was there at all. Some of them wore the polite masks they had perfected over years of networking. A faint, almost imperceptible smile that looked friendly from a distance but vanished the moment our eyes met. Others let the truth slip more openly. The small shake of the head, the brief tightening of the jaw, as though my presence itself was some sort of breach in decorum, a reminder of something they didn't want to be reminded of. I caught sight of one man I had worked beside for over a decade. We'd shared office coffee so bitter it could have stripped paint, traded stories about our families, and stood shoulder to shoulder in boardrooms where every decision felt like a gamble. Tonight, he passed close enough that I could have reached out and touched his sleeve, but his gaze fixed on the floor just ahead of me, his stride never faltering, not even when I shifted slightly, hoping for the smallest nod. It wasn't that they didn't know me, it was that they did, and knowing me now came with a cost they weren't willing to pay. Speaking to me would mean recognizing that I wasn't in that hall, that I had been left outside, that something about this arrangement wasn't right. And people at events like this don't like to stand near wrongness. It reflects too clearly in the glass. As they disappeared through the open doors, the warmth and light swallowed them up. I could hear laughter just inside, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of a room settling into its evening. My reflection in the marble wall beside me felt out of place, like a misplaced guest in someone else's memory. But if they thought my presence was an error, then the night was about to give them a much bigger one. Because I knew, with a quiet certainty, that before this evening ended, they wouldn't be able to pretend I wasn't here. Not anymore. The corridor felt colder than it should have, as if the air beyond the open doors had been deliberately kept warmer to make the divide between inside and outside impossible to ignore. The bench beneath me was narrow and hard, the kind of seating chosen not for comfort but for waiting, a temporary place, never meant to be lingered in. The polished marble floor stretched out in front of me, its pale surface reflecting the dull overhead lights, making the space feel emptier than it was. From where I sat, the double doors to the hall were slightly ajar. Through the gap, a sliver of golden light spilled across the floor, cutting a thin, bright line in the otherwise muted corridor. Voices floated through, low and rhythmic at first, growing louder as more people took their seats. There was a pattern to it, bursts of laughter followed by the clink of glassware, the subtle rise of music meant to signal the start of the evening. It was the familiar choreography of events like this, a world I had once moved through without hesitation. Now I was on the outside of it, reduced to an observer. Every sound from the hall carried a memory. The scrape of chairs reminded me of late banquets where I'd been seated close to the stage, swapping quiet jokes with the speaker before their turn. The gentle swell of background music brought back nights when I'd helped choose the playlist, making sure each note fit the tone of the evening. Even the muted laughter tugged at something old in me, the echo of my own voice among theirs, back when I was part of the circle, not orbiting it from the cold. In the corridor, my footsteps no longer mattered. My presence didn't blend with the hum of conversation or the rustle of programs being unfolded. Here there was only stillness. The occasional passing staff member would nod politely but not linger, their attention already pulled toward the glow beyond the doors. It was as if this space existed in another time, altogether. Slower, quieter, stripped of the ceremony that was already in full motion just a few feet away. The sound of the microphone coming to life sent a faint vibration through the air. A voice, measured, confident, began to welcome everyone. Applause rose, muffled by the walls but unmistakable in its enthusiasm. The ceremony had begun. I sat back against the wall, the cool plaster pressing through my jacket, and let the sounds wash over me. I knew this silence around me could feel like exile if I let it, but instead I treated it like a pause, a held breath, because somewhere inside that hall the night was building toward something, and I had the strange, steady feeling that when it arrived, it would carry my name whether they had written it in the program or not. Each minute stretched longer than the last, as if time itself wanted me to feel the weight of it. The longer I sat on that bench, the more the cold seemed to seep into my bones, not from the air, but from the thought pressing at the back of my mind. I wasn't out here because of some clerical error. This wasn't a mistake in a spreadsheet or a name forgotten in the shuffle of planning. This was deliberate. The realization carried a certain heaviness, the kind that settles low in your chest and stays there. I could have accepted a mix-up, a misprint, a lost email, even a misunderstanding at the door. Those things happen. But this was different. This was a decision. Somewhere in the weeks between the invitation and tonight, someone had decided that I did not belong in that room, and not just decided, enforced it, carried it out, and made sure the people who could have corrected it didn't. It was more than being left off a list. It was a message that I wasn't worth the chair, the place setting, the handshake at the table, that whatever I had done in the past, whatever part I had played in building the very thing they were here to celebrate, had been deemed irrelevant. My name didn't hold enough weight anymore to open a door. I could hear the rhythm of the evening unfolding inside, the measured cadence of a host's voice, the ripples of polite applause, the swell of music timed perfectly to signal transitions between speeches. It all had the familiar texture of nights I had once been part of, nights where I had been in the center of that current instead of standing ankle-deep at its edge. The bitterness rose slowly, almost against my will. I remembered the nights I'd stayed long after the lights had gone out, working on problems no one else wanted to touch. The moments when I'd spoken up for people in that very hall when no one else had their back. The times I'd quietly stepped aside so others could take the credit because the work had always mattered more than the applause. And now, here I was, erased, unacknowledged, sitting where the walls met the floor while they toasted the visionaries and pioneers. The bench creaked faintly when I shifted, but otherwise the corridor was silent, except for the faint echoes of the celebration spilling out from the open doors. I stared at that thin strip of golden light on the marble floor, the one that marked the line between where I was and where they were. It was such a small distance to cross, just a few steps, but it might as well have been miles. Still, I stayed, not because I had hope they would suddenly remember me, but because walking away would have felt like agreeing with them. And I knew something they didn't. Sometimes the ones they try to push out of the picture end up defining it. They just don't see it until it's too late. The security guard at the door couldn't have been more than 25. His suit was slightly too big, the sleeves brushing over the tops of his hands, and the earpiece in his ear seemed oversized against the curve of his jaw. He stood with the rigid posture of someone determined to do the job exactly as instructed, but every so often his eyes would wander in my direction. Not the sharp, assessing look of suspicion, but something softer, laced with a quiet question he couldn't ask. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was confusion. He was watching a man in a tailored suit, sitting quietly without protest, just outside the open doors of an event that clearly mattered. I could see it in his face. He was trying to put the pieces together. Why was I here, in the cold strip of hallway, instead of in the warmth and light? Why was my chair the hard wooden bench instead of one inside, with a view of the stage? Once, when there was a lull in the stream of guests, our eyes met for longer than before. He glanced down at the clipboard in his hand, the pages crumpled slightly at the edges from use, then back up at me. He didn't say anything. His orders didn't allow for that. But the smallest furrow appeared between his brows, as if my absence from his list didn't make sense to him either. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't a mistake, that somewhere in that room were people who knew exactly why I was out here, that my absence from the page wasn't an oversight. It was the end result of a choice someone had made long before he was handed that clipboard. But I didn't. He was just a young man doing his job, and in his world tonight the list was law. My name wasn't there. That was all that mattered. Still, his glances returned, brief but regular, as though he was checking to see if I'd moved, or maybe just to remind himself I was still there. In the moments when the door opened wider to let a group pass through, I caught the faintest flicker in his eyes. Not quite sympathy, but a subtle acknowledgement that my place on that bench was out of alignment with what he thought he was guarding. It struck me then how strange it was to be both invisible and seen at the same time. The people inside hadn't noticed I was missing, or if they had, they didn't care to admit it. But the guard, bound by his role and powerless to change my position, noticed me every time he looked up. And in that small, wordless recognition, I felt a reminder of something I'd almost forgotten. There's always someone who sees, even when they can't act. He didn't know it, but before the night was over, his job at that door would look very different. Because there would come a moment when that clipboard wouldn't matter anymore, when my name would arrive in that room without needing to pass through his page. The voices and music drifting from the hall began to blur into a steady hum, like the low roar of a distant ocean. Sitting there on the bench, my hands folded loosely in my lap, I felt my mind start to wander. The present dimmed, and the past, sharp, vivid, uninvited, came rushing in. I saw the early mornings, when the office was nothing more than a bare room with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that coughed more than it brewed. Back then, there were no polished speeches, no crowded events, no gilded invitations. There was just a handful of us, running on borrowed time and borrowed money, pushing forward because there was nothing else to do. I remembered staying long after dark, papers spread across the desk, my jacket slung over the back of a chair, the sound of my own pen scratching against the page, while the others fought to keep their eyes open. I remembered the faces of the people who were now inside, their voices filled with doubt in those early days. There were moments when the weight of failure pressed so heavily on the room that it felt impossible to breathe. And every time I found the words, not to promise miracles, but to remind them why we'd started. Sometimes that was all it took. one steady voice to hold the others together until morning came. There were risks, too, the kind that leave a mark. Signing my own name on things no one else would touch. Vouching for people who didn't yet know how to believe in themselves. Covering mistakes quietly so that someone else could keep their place at the table. I had done all of it without keeping score, because back then we were building something that belonged to all of us, or so I thought. In my mind, I could see the cramped offices growing into something larger. The first conference room, the first proper reception desk, the first time we could afford a door with our name on it. I remembered the look in their eyes when those milestones arrived. Pride, relief, maybe even gratitude. I thought those moments meant something permanent, that they forged a bond no amount of time or success could erase. Now, those same people sat inside, their laughter carrying through the thin gap in the doors. They didn't have to look at me tonight to remember who I was in those days, but they did have to choose not to, and that choice was louder than any toast they might make in there. I stayed still, letting the memories settle, each one both a comfort and a wound. I knew that if I let them, they could pull me into bitterness, but I also knew that the same history they were trying to overlook was the very thing that would make what was coming impossible to ignore. They had forgotten that I was there in the beginning. Tonight, they would remember. The hum from inside the hall shifted, growing more structured, more deliberate. Through the narrow gap in the doors, the faint background music faded, replaced by a voice, smooth, confident, and practiced. The host. Even muffled by the walls, the cadence was unmistakable. This was the part of the evening where the room was called to attention, where names began to matter. I leaned slightly forward on the bench, not because I expected to hear mine. I had already made peace with that possibility, but because I knew the weight those moments carried. The introductions weren't just formalities. They were the unspoken declaration of who belonged and who didn't, who was remembered and who was erased. The first name rang out clearly, and even from where I sat, I could hear the applause swell in response. Chairs scraped faintly as people turned to see the honored guest stand and offer a polite nod. The host's voice rose again, another name, another wave of clapping. The rhythm was familiar. Name, applause, smile, repeat. The names rolled on, some I knew well, some I barely recognized, but all of them passing through that ritual of acknowledgement. With each introduction, I could feel the air in my chest tighten a little more. Not because I needed the applause. I had lived long enough to know that applause fades quickly, but because every name that wasn't mine was another brick in the wall they were building between me and the story being told in that room. A story they wanted to keep neat, polished, uncomplicated by inconvenient truths. The list went on. Each name was met with the same enthusiasm, the same warmth, the same affirmation that this person mattered here. I pictured their faces as they rose to be recognized, the quick glances they exchanged with those at their table, the satisfied tilt of a chin when the applause lasted just a little longer than expected. All of it happening under the same lights I was meant to stand beneath. And then the introductions ended. My name had not been spoken. The applause faded, replaced by the rustle of programs and the low murmur of conversation as the evening moved forward. I sat back against the wall, feeling the cool plaster through my jacket. It wasn't the absence of my name that stung. It was the deliberate choice to keep it absent. I knew I was part of the history they were celebrating. I knew my work had shaped the very stage they were standing on, and yet, to the audience in that room, I didn't exist. But the thing about leaving someone's name out is that it only works if the night ends the way you planned it. And I had the distinct feeling that this one wouldn't. The shift was subtle at first. I had been sitting long enough to recognize the patterns in the evening's rhythm. The bright, formal tone of the host, the precise timing between applause and the start of the next segment. But then another voice took over, deeper and slower, the microphone catching the faint breath before each sentence. This wasn't the brisk efficiency of an MC moving through a program. This was someone stepping into the heart of the night, the keynote speaker. From the first few lines, I could hear the change in the room, even without seeing it. The scattered rustling of paper stopped. The small bursts of whispered conversation died away. The audience was leaning in now, their focus tightening around the voice that filled the space. And that voice, it had softened. The crisp edges of formality had blurred into something warmer, something that carried weight not through volume, but through sincerity. I found myself leaning slightly forward on the bench, my elbows on my knees, straining to catch every word. The speaker began talking about the early days, not just of the organization, but of the people who built it. He described the work as more than business, more than structure. He spoke of nights spent chasing solutions that seemed impossible, of the kind of belief that holds people together when resources run out and exhaustion sets in. The way he spoke, it wasn't theory. It wasn't an abstract tribute to nameless contributors. It was specific. So specific it felt like he was reaching back into my own memory and pulling it forward. He was telling a story, and though he hadn't named me, I could feel my fingerprints all over it. There was a warmth in his tone that didn't match the omission of my name earlier. It was personal, intimate even, like the voice of someone remembering a debt they hadn't fully repaid. It reached past the wall of exclusion and brushed against something I'd thought had been shut away years ago. The part of me that still wanted to believe recognition could be honest. I sat still, listening, my eyes fixed on the narrow strip of golden light spilling from the doorway. I couldn't see the stage, couldn't see the faces turning toward the speaker, but I could sense the shift in the room. The applause from earlier had been polite, expected. This silence was different. This was the quiet that comes when a room realizes it is being told the truth, and it doesn't want to miss a word. I didn't know yet if that truth would carry my name with it, but I could feel it getting closer, and with each sentence, the distance between the bench and the stage seemed to shrink. Inside, the shift was unmistakable. It began as a faint ripple, the kind of noise you hear when a large crowd inhales all at once, but doesn't exhale in unison. My name had landed in the center of the room like a dropped stone, and now the waves were moving outward, disturbing the smooth surface they'd so carefully arranged. The applause that followed wasn't uniform, not the crisp, synchronized clapping I'd heard for the other names earlier. It was jagged, uneven, pockets of hands coming together here and there, some polite, some hesitant, some genuine but quickly silenced when they realized not everyone was joining in. The timing was all wrong, the rhythm broken. That's what happens when people aren't sure what the right response is. And beneath it, layered like an undercurrent, came the sound I knew well, the low, restless murmur of a room no longer entirely in agreement with itself. Conversations had started, quick and hushed, voices pitched just low enough to avoid carrying too far. Chairs shifted on the carpet, silverware tapped against plates. It wasn't chaos, not yet, but it was no longer control either. I pictured them. The rows of tables with their perfect centerpieces, the champagne catching the warm light, the faces turned toward one another in small, nervous movements. Those who didn't know me would be leaning to their neighbors, whispering, "Who is that? Why is everyone reacting like this?" And the ones who did know, they'd be avoiding each other's eyes entirely. They'd be looking anywhere but toward the back of the hall, because to look there would be to acknowledge that they knew exactly where I wasn't. And those few, the ones who knew the whole truth, they'd feel it most. The knowledge that I was not in the room by choice would be impossible to hide behind polite smiles now. They'd remember walking past me in the hallway, the way they'd quickened their steps, the way they'd tightened their lips into something that could be mistaken for focus. But there's no mistaking avoidance when the name you've avoided suddenly fills the room. I could almost see the discomfort traveling down the tables. A woman shifting in her chair and straightening the folds of her dress just to keep her hands busy. A man adjusting his napkin twice before setting it down again. Someone picking up their water glass, not because they were thirsty, but because it gave them something to do with their eyes. These weren't gestures of ease. They were the small, involuntary movements of people who want to leave a conversation without standing up. Through it all, the keynote speaker's voice never faltered. If anything, it grew steadier, each sentence deliberate, unhurried, like someone laying stones one by one, building something no one could take apart. He spoke of foundations, of moments when the right person in the right place made all the difference. He didn't have to point to me. His words were enough to turn heads toward the space they'd left empty for me, whether they wanted to or not. On the bench outside, I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't need to move. I didn't need to open the door. My name had already done that for me, slipping past the guard, past the program, past every gate they'd set up to keep me out. It was moving from table to table now, quietly, persistently, refusing to leave the room. And as the applause sputtered out and the murmurs rose again, I realized something. For the first time that night, it wasn't me who was sitting uncomfortably on the edge of things. It was them. And the night was only just beginning to turn. The first thing I noticed was the guard's stillness. He had been standing in his post all evening, weight shifting from one foot to the other, in those small unconscious movements of someone who has been told to stand in one spot for hours. But now he wasn't moving at all. His eyes were fixed somewhere inside the hall, his grip on the clipboard loosening, the paper curling slightly under his fingers. It was as if he'd just realized the air in the room had changed, that something said inside had rearranged the invisible lines of authority he'd been told to follow. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his head toward me. There was no confusion in his face now, no question about why I was here. There was only the awareness that his list no longer mattered. Without a word, he stepped to the side and placed his hand on the door. He pushed it open wider, not just enough to slip through, but wide enough that the golden light from inside spilled fully into the corridor, banishing the strip of cold shadow I'd been sitting in all night. Then, with a short, almost formal gesture, he motioned for me to go in. I rose from the bench, my knees stiff from hours of stillness. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor was louder than I expected, sharp enough to draw a few glances from the guests sitting closest to the doorway. My footsteps echoed softly as I crossed the threshold. The moment I stepped into the room, everything shifted. The voices fell, the faint rustle of movement stilled. Heads turned, not in the casual, distracted way people glance toward a latecomer, but with the deliberate precision of a room collectively aware that something significant had just happened. I saw them, the faces that had avoided mine earlier in the evening, the ones who had found something deeply interesting in the floor or the far wall when they passed me in the corridor. Now their eyes were locked on me, and the expression was different. No longer avoidance, no longer the polite indifference they'd worn like armor. There was something heavier there now. Recognition, yes, but also the unspoken understanding that the moment they had tried to prevent had arrived. Some looked almost relieved, as though my presence completed a picture that had felt wrong without me. Others seemed uneasy, their posture shifting in small, betraying ways. A hand tightening on a napkin, a shoulder tensing, eyes darting briefly toward the stage before returning to me. And there were a few, just a few, whose gazes held something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was guilt, maybe both. I didn't rush. Each step forward carried the weight of every year that had led to this moment. The chandeliers above cast a warm light that seemed to follow me across the carpet, past the rows of tables, past the wine glasses catching the glow. The room was utterly still, except for the quiet, steady voice of the keynote speaker, who had not stopped talking since my name had been spoken, as if my entrance was simply the next natural beat in the story he was telling. And, in a way, it was. I hadn't forced the door open. I hadn't demanded a place. I had simply waited, knowing that the truth, once spoken, would make the space for me. And now, with the guard standing aside and the entire room turned toward me, I knew that every person here understood. I was no longer on the outside, and nothing they did could put me back there. The first step onto the carpet felt heavier than it should have, as though the floor itself was aware of the weight it now carried. The room was utterly still, the kind of stillness that isn't silent but charged, like the pause before the first note of a symphony. My shoes sank slightly into the thick fabric, each movement slow, deliberate, unhurried. The sound was faint, yet in the quiet it seemed amplified, the soft thud of each step stretching into something more than noise. It was a rhythm, a heartbeat. I didn't look down. My eyes stayed forward, but in my periphery, I could feel every gaze tracking me. Conversations that had been flowing only minutes ago were gone. Glasses half lifted were set quietly back on tables. Someone shifted in their chair, the scrape of the leg on the floor cutting through the air like a scratch on a record, and then the stillness returned. The chandeliers above bathed the path in a warm, almost golden light. It caught the glint of cutlery, shimmered across crystal glasses, and brushed against the edges of the stage ahead. The tables flanking my walk seemed to recede into shadow, leaving the narrow lane of my path lit as if it had been prepared for me all along. There was no applause, no fanfare, no voice booming from the microphone to narrate what was happening. But this wasn't the kind of moment that needed volume. This was quieter, sharper, a victory not built from noise, but from inevitability. The kind of victory that seeps in like water through stone, slow but unstoppable. As I passed, I caught the smallest shifts in the faces turned toward me. Some eyes softened, the tight lines around them loosening as if they were letting go of a lie they had carried too long. Others remained guarded, lips pressed in thin, unreadable lines, refusing to betray whatever they felt. And there were those whose stares flickered with discomfort. Not because I was here, but because they knew my being here meant a truth they'd ignored, could no longer be kept in the dark. I could see the stage now, the speaker still talking, his voice steady, weaving my presence seamlessly into the narrative. He didn't stop to acknowledge me, because he didn't need to. Every word he spoke was an acknowledgement. Every step I took was proof. The two of us, without planning it, were working in tandem. He told the truth, and I walked through it. Halfway there, I realized this wasn't about reclaiming a seat or hearing my name again. It wasn't even about the people in the room. It was about the fact that the one thing they had tried to erase was now standing in front of them, moving closer with each measured stride, and that once I reached the stage, whether I spoke a word or not, the fact of my presence would stay with them long after the last speech ended. By the time I reached the steps leading up, the hum of the hall, the faint restrained breathing, the shifting of posture, the almost imperceptible pulse of the crowd, had become a single unified thing. Every eye was on me. Every thought was tethered to what they could not undo. And in that moment, I understood exactly what I was carrying. Not just my history, but the undeniable truth of it. The kind of truth that, once it enters a room, never leaves. When I reached the edge of the stage, the speaker turned toward me. He didn't pause for effect, didn't let the moment hang in that theatrical way some people use to control a crowd. Instead, he continued speaking in the same calm, steady tone he'd held all evening, and then without warning he extended his hand toward me. It wasn't just a gesture of welcome. It was deliberate, unshakable, the kind of movement that says, "This is exactly where you are supposed to be." His eyes met mine, and in that brief connection I saw something I hadn't seen in years from anyone in this circle. Complete absence of hesitation, no calculation, no scanning the room to see who was watching, just certainty. "Without him," he said, his voice carrying clean and clear over the quiet room, "none of this would exist." The words were simple, stripped of ornament, free of the kind of hollow praise that gets tossed around in speeches like this. But the way they landed was anything but simple. They cut through years of silence, through the layers of polite dismissal and careful omission that had been built around me. I could feel them strike the people in the room, some visibly startled, some leaning back slightly in their chairs as if bracing for the impact. I saw the wall they had built in their minds, the one where I didn't matter anymore, where my absence from their events was natural and unremarkable, begin to crack. The sentence had been only 8 words long, but it carried the weight of years, the kind of truth that refuses to be softened or ignored. And it hadn't come from me. It had come from someone they respected, someone standing at the very center of the celebration. That made it impossible to dismiss. From where I stood, I could sense the shift. The people who had avoided my eyes earlier now couldn't look away. A few nodded almost unconsciously, as if the truth in his voice left them no room to deny it. Others looked down at their plates, their hands tightening around forks or glasses, their stillness betraying the discomfort of being caught on the wrong side of history. The applause that followed wasn't immediate. There was a heartbeat of silence first, a collective pause where the room seemed to absorb what had just been said, and then it came, slow at the start, then gathering strength, until the sound filled the hall in uneven but undeniable waves. I didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for triumph in the way they might imagine. It was something quieter, heavier. This wasn't about winning. It was about the simple, immovable fact of being recognized for what I had done, publicly, without qualification, without anyone being able to rewrite it afterward. And as I stood there with his hand still extended toward me, I knew that even after tonight's speeches faded into memory, those 8 words would remain. They would echo in this room long after the tables were cleared, in conversations they'd have when they thought no one was listening. Because once a truth like that is spoken out loud, it never truly leaves. When the speeches ended and the room began to breathe again, I didn't linger at the stage. I didn't sit at any of the tables that were suddenly pulling out chairs for me. I didn't stay for the champagne that was being poured with forced enthusiasm, or the polite conversations that would inevitably come wrapped in awkward apologies disguised as small talk. I had no interest in letting anyone rewrite this moment to make themselves more comfortable. I stepped down from the stage the same way I had walked up, slow, steady, each movement deliberate. The chandeliers still poured their warm light over the room, but now it felt different. Less like a glow for celebration, and more like a spotlight that couldn't be turned away. People watched me pass, their gazes following even when I didn't meet them. No one avoided my eyes now, but the difference was I didn't need their eyes anymore. The doors were still open when I reached them. The guard, the young man with the too big jacket and the list that no longer mattered, stood to the side. There was a faint nod between us. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had seen the before and after. That was enough. The corridor outside was cooler than the hall, the air fresh against my face after hours under the weight of the crowd. My footsteps echoed on the marble as I walked away from the doorway, away from the applause that was still fading behind me. Each step loosened something inside me, something that had been coiled tight for longer than I wanted to admit. I didn't leave with triumph in my chest. There was no soaring music in my head, no urge to look back over my shoulder for one last glance. What I carried instead was stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when the balance has finally tipped back into place, when the scale that had been uneven for years settles without fanfare. Justice, I realized, was never in the noise. It wasn't in the clapping hands or the sudden warmth of people who had once turned away. It wasn't in the invitations that might appear again after this night. Justice was in the fact that they had been forced, by truth, by memory, by the weight of what couldn't be erased, to acknowledge me exactly as I was, without their edits. The real victory wasn't walking into that room. It was knowing that even if they had never opened the door, the truth would have found its way in, that it would have been spoken, with or without my presence, because it had lived too long in the walls and the history they were trying to celebrate to be kept quiet. By the time I stepped outside into the night, the air was cool and clean, the city lights stretching out in every direction. I felt the tension leave me completely, replaced by something calmer and far more lasting than applause. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from forgetting, but the deep, immovable peace that comes from knowing the world has finally admitted what you've known all along, even if it once tried to forget you. And that, I thought, as I walked away from the building and into the quiet streets, was enough, more than enough.